The dust cloud trailing Ramon Delgado's pickup truck settled over the dirt road leading to what would become his farm on a blistering July afternoon in 1963, and the neighbors who bothered to look saw only another Mexican who did not belong in their California valley. At 41 years old, Ramon stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, with shoulders broadened by 3 decades of physical labor and hands that bore scars from every kind of agricultural work imaginable. His face showed the weathering of a man who had spent his entire life outdoors, deep lines around his eyes from squinting against the sun, and a complexion darkened by genetics and endless exposure. He arrived alone, driving a truck that was more rust than metal, carrying tools that looked older than he was, and pulling a trailer containing everything he owned in the world. The property he had just purchased was 80 acres of agricultural failure, land that 3 previous owners had abandoned after their crops failed and their wells produced water too alkaline for irrigation or drinking. The farm's recent history was a catalogue of agricultural disasters that had convinced most local farmers the land was fundamentally cursed and unsuitable for productive use. The previous owner, a German immigrant named Klaus Hoffmann, had gone bankrupt trying to grow almonds on soil that seemed to poison everything planted in it. Before him, a corporate agricultural company had attempted cotton production only to watch their entire crop wither, despite abundant irrigation and expensive fertilizers. The owner before that had tried cattle ranching, but found that animals drinking from the property's wells developed health problems that made them unmarketable. The general consensus among Kern County farmers was that the 80 acres Ramon had purchased represented the worst agricultural land in a region famous for productive farming. The soil tests showed dangerous mineral concentrations, the water table was contaminated with naturally occurring compounds that made it unusable, and the property's location in a slight depression meant it flooded during rare heavy rains while suffering worse than surrounding areas during droughts. Ramon had paid $18,000 for the property, a price that reflected its worthlessness and that had consumed every dollar he had saved during 23 years of agricultural labor in California. He had arrived in the United States in 1940 at age 18, crossing the border legally during a period when Mexican agricultural workers were actively recruited to address wartime labor shortages. He had worked in the fields of the Central Valley for 2 decades, learning American farming methods while observing their weaknesses and limitations. Unlike most migrant workers who sent money back to Mexico or spent it on immediate needs, Ramon had saved with obsessive discipline, living in the cheapest housing, eating the simplest food, and avoiding all unnecessary expenses. His goal had always been to own his own land, not to work for others forever, and he had studied every agricultural property that came on the market for years before finding one he could afford. The fact that the land he finally purchased was considered worthless by everyone else did not concern him, because Ramon saw something that American farmers trained in industrial agriculture could not recognize. The neighbors' hostility began immediately and intensified rapidly, fueled by racial prejudice, economic resentment, and genuine puzzlement at why anyone would waste money on that cursed property. The farm directly east of Ramon's belonged to Robert Mackenzie, a third-generation California farmer who operated 600 acres of highly profitable cotton and considered himself an expert on everything related to agriculture. Mackenzie had bid on Ramon's property years earlier, offering $12,000, intending to use it for equipment storage since it was worthless for growing anything. When he learned that a Mexican laborer had paid $18,000 for land he considered valueless, his reaction mixed outrage with contemptuous amusement. He told everyone at the local grain elevator that some stupid Mexican had just thrown away 20 years of savings on the worst land in the county, and that they would all enjoy watching him fail. The other neighbors shared Mackenzie's sentiment with varying degrees of nastiness, united in their certainty that Ramon would abandon the property within 2 years after discovering what every previous owner had learned. The community's prejudice against Ramon was not subtle or concealed, but openly expressed with the casual racism that characterized rural California in the 1960s, despite the region's dependence on Mexican labor. The local feed store owner told Ramon directly that he preferred not to extend credit to Mexicans, claiming they were unreliable customers. The equipment dealer charged him higher prices than he quoted to Anglo farmers, assuming Ramon would not notice or complain. The county agricultural extension office refused to provide him with the technical assistance they routinely offered to other farmers, with an agent explaining that their services were intended for serious commercial operations, not hobby farms. The local diner that served as an unofficial farmers' meeting place made clear through hostile stares and slow service that Ramon was not welcome. Even the bank that had financed his land purchase treated him with thinly veiled contempt, with the loan officer telling colleagues that he had approved the loan only because there was no risk since Ramon had paid cash and the bank was not exposed. What puzzled and then irritated the neighbors most intensely was that Ramon did not behave like the failing farmer they expected and wanted him to be. Instead of immediately planting crops that would inevitably fail and prove them right, he spent his first 6 months doing nothing visible except digging. He excavated a massive hole near the center of his property, piling dirt in enormous mounds that grew daily. He worked from before sunrise until after sunset, operating rented backhoe with skill that suggested extensive experience. He dug trenches that radiated from the central excavation in patterns that made no sense to observers who watched from their properties with binoculars. He brought in truckloads of materials whose purpose nobody could identify, strange clay-like substances, layers of different colored rocks and wooden forms that he assembled and then buried. When neighbors asked what he was building, Ramon responded politely but vaguely, saying he was preparing for farming but never explaining what the excavation had to do with growing crops. His evasiveness fueled speculation that ranged from mildly curious to actively hostile. Robert Mackenzie became obsessed with understanding what Ramon was doing, convinced that the Mexican was either genuinely crazy or attempting something illegal that needed to be reported to authorities. He drove by Ramon's property multiple times daily, documenting the construction work with photographs that he showed to other farmers while speculating about criminal activity. He reported Ramon to the county building department, claiming unpermitted construction, though inspectors found nothing that required permits since Ramon was only excavating on his own property. He contacted the sheriff's department suggesting that Ramon might be building facilities for smuggling or drug storage, but deputies who investigated found only agricultural earthworks. Mackenzie's obsession revealed something beyond simple prejudice or nosiness. It reflected his deep discomfort at being unable to understand what a Mexican laborer was doing with sophisticated excavation that appeared to follow some plan that Mackenzie, despite his agricultural education, could not comprehend. The idea that Ramon possessed knowledge that he lacked was intolerable to Mackenzie's self-image as the valley's agricultural expert. The community's mockery intensified as Ramon's mysterious construction project continued through the winter of 1963 and into 1964 without any visible farming activity. He expanded his excavations to cover nearly 15 acres of his property, creating a network of trenches, chambers, and channels that looked from aerial perspective like some enormous abstract pattern. He lined the excavations with multiple layers of materials, working with precision that suggested he was following specific engineering principles rather than simply digging randomly. He installed clay pipes that he had somehow acquired or manufactured himself, creating a network of underground conduits connecting the various excavated areas. Most bizarrely, from his neighbor's perspective, he seemed to be building everything in reverse. Instead of building up like normal construction, everything went down into the earth where it disappeared from view. By spring 1964, Ramon had spent over $30,000 on his underground construction, money he had somehow acquired beyond his original savings, and the neighbors began calling his property the Money Pit, comparing it to the famous Mystery of Oak Island, where treasure hunters had wasted fortunes on fruitless digging. What none of the neighbors understood, because their agricultural education had focused exclusively on industrial farming techniques, was that Ramon was building a qanat system, an ancient water management technology developed in Persia over 2,000 years earlier and refined in Mexico over centuries of adaptation. The system used gravitational flow and natural filtration to capture, store, and purify water in underground chambers and channels that minimized evaporation and prevented contamination. Ramon had learned the principles of qanat construction from his grandfather in Guanajuato, where similar systems had sustained agriculture in arid regions for generations. He had spent his years working in California's fields, studying the hydrology of the Central Valley, understanding where water flowed underground and how the region's geology could be used for natural filtration. The property he had purchased, despite appearing worthless on the surface, sat atop an underground aquifer that was contaminated with minerals but could be purified through proper filtration. The slight depression that caused flooding during heavy rains meant that surface water naturally flowed toward his property, water that could be captured and stored underground. What looked like a failed farm to American eyes was actually an ideal location for traditional water management that modern agricultural engineers had forgotten existed. The construction of Ramon's underground water system required skills and knowledge that he had accumulated over decades of careful observation and study, combined with traditional techniques passed through his family. He excavated his main chamber to reach the water table at 38 feet depth, lining it with impermeable clay he had trucked from a deposit he had located 40 miles away. He built filtration galleries using carefully graded layers of sand, gravel, and crushed volcanic rock that would remove the minerals, making the groundwater unusable. He constructed the network of channels to follow the natural gradient of the land, ensuring that water would flow through his system using only gravity without requiring pumping. He designed overflow chambers that would capture floodwater during rare heavy rains, channeling it underground rather than allowing it to pool uselessly on the surface. Most importantly, he built enormous storage capacity, a network of underground chambers that could hold over 2 million gallons of water, enough to irrigate his entire property through multiple growing seasons even without rainfall. The engineering was sophisticated and the execution was precise, representing knowledge that agricultural colleges no longer taught. By fall 1964, Ramon had completed the underground portions of his water system and began covering everything, backfilling the excavations and restoring the surface to agricultural use. The neighbors watched with satisfaction, believing that the crazy Mexican had finally realized his project was pointless and was now trying to hide the evidence of his failure. Robert Mackenzie told anyone who would listen that Ramon had probably run out of money and was now preparing to abandon the property, and that in a year or two the land would be back on the market at a price that Mackenzie could afford. The mockery reached its peak when Ramon began his actual farming operations in spring 1965. Planting crops that seemed random and poorly chosen for the region, he planted 20 acres of chili peppers, a crop that most California farmers considered marginally profitable at best. He planted 15 acres of melons, which required enormous amounts of water that everyone knew his property could not provide. He planted 10 acres of tomatoes using heirloom varieties that commercial farmers had abandoned. in favor of hybrid breeds. The remaining acreage he devoted to beans, squash, and other vegetables that seemed like hobby farming rather than serious commercial agriculture. The transformation of Ramon's property from agricultural wasteland to productive farm happened so quickly and completely that neighbors initially assumed he had somehow found a way to truck in water from elsewhere or had drilled an impossibly deep well. Within 6 weeks of planting, his crops were thriving with vigor that far exceeded anything growing on neighboring properties, despite the superior soil those farms enjoyed. His chili peppers grew with remarkable uniformity, producing fruits that were larger and more flavorful than varieties that typically grew in the region. His melons swelled to enormous size, developing the intense sweetness that comes only from perfectly calibrated irrigation. His heirloom tomatoes produced abundantly, yielding fruits that looked like they belonged in agricultural magazines. Most remarkably, his crops showed none of the stress that affected neighboring farms during the hot summer months when irrigation demands peaked. While other farmers watched their plants wilt during midday heat despite heavy watering, Ramon's crops remained vigorous and healthy throughout the day. The explanation for his crops' extraordinary performance was the underground water system that maintained consistent soil moisture and temperature while providing perfectly filtered water free of the mineral contaminants that stressed plants on neighboring properties. Ramon's Canat system kept his root zones at optimal moisture levels through subsurface irrigation that eliminated water waste from evaporation. The underground storage meant that his water supply was naturally cooled by the Earth's temperature, so his irrigation did not shock plants with hot water during summer afternoons. The filtration galleries he had built removed minerals that accumulated in other farms' soils over years of irrigation with contaminated well water. Most importantly, his system provided completely reliable water supply regardless of surface conditions, making him independent of the wells and irrigation districts that other farmers depended upon. He had transformed worthless land into some of the most productive agricultural property in the county through engineering that none of his neighbors understood or could replicate. Ramon's first harvest in fall 1965 produced crops of such exceptional quality that commercial buyers offered premium prices that exceeded anything neighboring farmers received for conventional produce. His chili peppers were purchased by specialty food processors who valued their superior flavor and consistent heat. His melons sold to high-end retailers for prices double the commodity rate because their taste and appearance were outstanding. His heirloom tomatoes attracted buyers from urban restaurants willing to pay extraordinary amounts for ingredients that actually tasted like tomatoes rather than the flavorless commercial varieties that dominated markets. His total revenue from 80 acres exceeded $100,000, a figure that represented productivity per acre far beyond what even the best conventional farms achieved. The neighbors who had mocked him could not ignore these results, but rather than acknowledging that Ramon knew something they did not, most attributed his success to luck or suspected he was somehow cheating, perhaps using illegal water sources or receiving government subsidies unavailable to regular farmers. Robert Mackenzie's reaction to Ramon's success mixed genuine puzzlement with resentment and an unwillingness to credit a Mexican laborer with superior agricultural knowledge. He conducted his own investigation, walking Ramon's property boundaries, looking for evidence of secret water pipes from irrigation districts or hidden wells that would explain the impossible productivity. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. All of Ramon's water came from the underground system that was completely invisible from the surface. Mackenzie examined Ramon's crops closely, looking for signs of excessive fertilizer use or growth hormones that might explain their vigor, but found only healthy plants growing in what appeared to be ordinary soil. He took soil samples from the border of their properties and had them analyzed. Discovering that Ramon's soil was actually inferior to his own, in most measurable characteristics, which made the productivity difference even more inexplicable. Unable to understand how Ramon achieved his results, Mackenzie began spreading rumors that Ramon must be involved in something illegal, that no legitimate farmer could succeed on that land using legal methods. Other neighbors embraced these conspiracy theories because accepting the alternative, that Ramon possessed superior agricultural knowledge, was psychologically unbearable. The years from 1966 to 1974 established Ramon as one of the most consistently successful farmers in Kern County, despite the continued social exclusion and prejudice he faced from his neighbors. His productivity remained exceptional year after year, unaffected by the weather variations that created boom and bust cycles for conventional farmers. During wet years, when most farms had excess water and average yields, Ramon's carefully controlled irrigation produced premium quality that commanded higher prices. During dry years, when other farms struggled with water shortages and reduced output, Ramon's underground storage kept his production stable, allowing him to capitalize on scarcity pricing. He expanded his cultivated acreage gradually, extending his underground water network to eventually serve 60 of his 80 acres. He diversified his crops based on market demands, always choosing varieties that benefited from his superior water quality and reliable irrigation. He built a modest packing facility and cold storage that allowed him to process and store his produce, capturing more value by selling directly to buyers rather than through intermediaries who took large percentages. Despite his obvious success, Ramon remained socially isolated in the community, never invited to join the growers' associations, never welcomed at the informal gatherings where farming neighbors shared information and socialized. He accepted this exclusion without apparent bitterness, focusing on his farm and maintaining minimal but polite contact with neighbors who made clear they did not want friendship. He hired local workers during harvest seasons, always paying above-market wages and treating employees with respect that earned him loyalty and reliable labor when he needed it. He purchased supplies from local businesses despite their obvious reluctance to serve him, never complaining about the discriminatory treatment or higher prices he was charged. He paid his taxes promptly and maintained his property immaculately, giving his critics no legitimate complaints even as they continued to resent his presence. His dignified response to ongoing discrimination made him more threatening to neighbors who could not dismiss him as the failing, bitter outsider they wanted him to be. The drought that began in 1975 would become the worst in California's recorded history to that point, a multi-year catastrophe that devastated the state's agricultural economy and revealed the fragility of farming systems dependent on underground aquifers that were being depleted faster than nature replenished them. The winter of 1974-75 brought almost no rain to Central California, and the following winter was equally dry. By spring 1976, the drought severity was becoming undeniable as wells throughout the Central Valley began failing. Farmers who had never worried about water suddenly faced the reality that their wells were producing at fractions of historical rates or going dry completely. The water table had dropped so far that even deep wells could not reach it, and the groundwater that remained was increasingly concentrated with minerals as the aquifer's volume decreased. Agricultural production collapsed across the region, with farmers forced to leave fields unplanted because they had no water for irrigation. Thousands of agricultural workers lost their jobs as farms that normally employed hundreds reduced operations to skeleton crews maintaining only their most valuable permanent crops. Kern County suffered as severely as any agricultural region in California, with the drought exposing how completely local farming depended on groundwater extraction that was unsustainable over the long term. Robert Mackenzie, watched his wells fail one after another throughout 1976, forcing him to abandon over 300 acres of annual crops and seeing his almond trees begin to die from water stress. Other neighbors faced similar catastrophes as wells that had produced abundantly for decades suddenly went dry or produced only trickles of increasingly saline water. Emergency well drilling found that the aquifer had dropped far below previous levels and that reaching water required drilling to depths that cost tens of thousands of dollars with no guarantee of adequate flow. The irrigation district that supplied surface water to some properties announced they would provide only 30% of normal allocations, forcing farmers to make impossible choices about which crops to try to save. By summer 1976, the agricultural landscape of Kern County had transformed from green productivity to brown desolation as crops died and orchards withered across thousands of acres. The most shocking and enraging aspect of the drought for Ramon's neighbors was that his property remained green and productive while everything around him died, a contrast so stark it looked like a propaganda photo illustrating agricultural success and failure. His crops continued thriving with the same vigor they had always shown, completely unaffected by the catastrophic water shortage devastating every other farm in the region. His child peppers produced abundantly at a time when California's pepper production had dropped by 70%. His melons grew large and sweet, while neighboring properties planted in melons had been abandoned because there was no water for irrigation. His vegetable crops flourished while the region's fresh produce output collapsed. From aerial photographs, Ramon's 80 acres appeared as an impossible island of green in a sea of brown, a visual representation that his farming methods were fundamentally different from anything his neighbors understood. The contrast was so dramatic that county agricultural officials investigated, certain that Ramon must be stealing water from somewhere, but they found no evidence of any connection to external water sources. The revelation of Ramon's underground water system came not through his choice to share the information, but through desperation that drove his neighbors to beg for explanations they had been too proud to request during the 12 years they had mocked him. Robert Mackenzie appeared at Ramon's door in August 1976, a broken man facing bankruptcy as his 600 acres of crops died and his wells produced nothing. He asked directly what Ramon had built beneath his property that made him immune to the drought destroying everyone else, and for the first time, Ramon explained the canal system he had spent years constructing. He took Mackenzie into his fields and showed him the access points to his underground network, explaining how the system captured and stored water during wet periods and filtered contaminated groundwater into usable irrigation supplies. He described the engineering principles that made the system work using only gravity and natural processes rather than pumping. Most importantly, he revealed that his underground chambers currently held over 1 million gallons of water, enough to irrigate his crops through another full year, even if no rain fell at all. Mackenzie's reaction to Ramon's explanation mixed awe at the sophisticated engineering, shame at having mocked what he had not understood, and desperate hope that somehow Ramon's water could save his dying farm. He asked if Ramon would sell him water, offering prices that reflected true desperation, $100 per 1,000 gallons, 10 times the normal cost of irrigation water. Other neighbors soon learned about Ramon's water supply through the rural gossip network that moved information faster than any technology. Within days, a dozen farmers appeared at Ramon's property asking, pleading, or demanding that he share his water with the community facing catastrophe. Some offered money, some appealed to Christian charity, and some suggested that water was a common resource that should not be hoarded while neighbors suffered. They argued that Ramon had a moral obligation to help. that it was wrong to have water while others went without, and that refusing to share during a crisis revealed selfishness that justified all their previous hostility toward him. The farmers who came begging were the same ones who had mocked him for 12 years, who had charged him discriminatory prices, who had excluded him from their community, and who had spread rumors that he must be doing something illegal. Now they wanted what he had built while they ridiculed him. Ramon's response to his neighbors' pleas revealed the character that the previous 12 years had forged through persistent discrimination and social exclusion. He told them he would share his water under specific conditions that were non-negotiable and that reflected both practical limitations and a requirement that they acknowledge what they had done. First, he would provide water only to farmers, who admitted in writing that they had discriminated against him and apologized for their behavior. Second, water would be distributed based on need for maintaining permanent crops like orchards, not for annual crops that could simply be replanted after the drought ended. Third, recipients would pay not market rates, but would instead agree to provide labor, helping Ramon expand his Qanat system after the drought ended, so that the community would have greater water security in future crises. Fourth, any farmer receiving water would have to attend educational sessions where Ramon would teach the engineering principles of underground water systems so that others could build their own. These conditions outraged some neighbors who thought Ramon should simply give them water out of Christian charity or community obligation, but others understood that his requirements were actually generous, given how they had treated him. Robert Mackenzie was the first to accept Ramon's conditions, appearing at his door with a handwritten letter acknowledging that he had discriminated against Ramon based on prejudice, that he had been wrong to mock what he did not understand, and that he apologized for 12 years of hostile behavior. The letter's humility was genuine because Mackenzie faced losing everything his family had built over 3 generations, and his pride was a small price for water that might save his almond orchards. Ramon provided Mackenzie with sufficient water to keep his most valuable trees alive, delivering it not through some magical extension of his underground system, but through the prosaic method of tank trucks that Mackenzie had to arrange and pay for. Other farmers followed Mackenzie's example over the following weeks, some writing apologetic letters that seemed sincere, while others produced statements that were grudging and minimal. Ramon held firm on his conditions, refusing water to anyone who would not acknowledge their discrimination. Some farmers angrily rejected his requirements, calling him vindictive and claiming this proved Mexicans were not real Americans. They chose to watch their crops die rather than admit they had been wrong. The educational sessions Ramon conducted during late 1976 and 1977 revealed to his neighbors the sophistication of knowledge they had dismissed as primitive and demonstrated that their agricultural education had been narrowly focused on industrial methods that were not sustainable. He taught the hydrological principles that made Qanat systems work, explaining how understanding groundwater movement allowed capturing water that conventional wells could not reach. He demonstrated the filtration techniques that removed minerals naturally, avoiding the soil degradation that resulted from irrigating with contaminated water. He showed them the engineering calculations needed to design channels that would flow using only gravity, eliminating pumping costs and the energy dependency of conventional irrigation. Most fundamentally, he explained that traditional agricultural knowledge developed over centuries in water-scarce regions was not primitive but sophisticated, representing solutions to problems that modern farming had not adequately addressed. The farmers who attended these sessions discovered that a Mexican laborer they had dismissed as uneducated possessed engineering knowledge that exceeded anything taught in agricultural colleges. The drought ended in the winter of 1977-78 when heavy rains finally returned to California, but its impacts on Kern County's agricultural community were permanent and transformative. Farms that had failed were purchased by corporations that brought industrial-scale operations with deeper capital reserves to survive future droughts. Some farmers who had been bailed out by Ramon's water remained on their land, but with drastically reduced operations and heavy debt from drought losses. The lucky ones had received enough water to save their permanent crops and could restart annual crop production, though they faced years recovering from financial damage. Most significantly, attitudes toward water management shifted from the complacent assumption that groundwater was unlimited to a recognition that traditional pumping practices were depleting aquifers unsustainably. Agricultural engineers and university researchers suddenly became interested in traditional water management systems that they had previously dismissed as irrelevant to modern farming. Ramon found himself invited to speak at agricultural conferences and consulted by farmers throughout California who wanted to understand underground water storage methods that could provide drought resilience. The expansion of canal-style water systems across California during the 1980s represented the mainstreaming of knowledge that Ramon had brought from Mexico and that had been dismissed as primitive until crisis forced recognition of its value. With Ramon's consultation, several dozen farmers in Kern County built their own underground water storage systems, adapted to their specific properties and smaller in scale than Ramon's, but following the same principles. Universities established research programs studying traditional water management technologies from various cultures, recognizing that indigenous and traditional knowledge offered solutions to problems that modern engineering had not solved. State water agencies began promoting underground storage as a strategy for increasing California's water resilience, funding projects that basically implemented techniques that Ramon had been using for 20 years. The irony that government now promoted and subsidized methods they had once implicitly dismissed when Ramon built his system was not lost on anyone, though few acknowledged it directly. Ramon himself benefited modestly from consulting fees, but was more motivated by satisfaction at seeing valuable knowledge preserved and expanded rather than lost to modernization's dismissive arrogance. The respect that Ramon eventually received from his neighbors remained complicated by the racial prejudices that 12 years of success could not entirely erase, and by resentments that some harbored toward the man who had exposed their agricultural ignorance. Robert Mackenzie became something approaching a friend, genuinely transformed by the experience of being saved by someone he had despised and working to educate other farmers about their prejudices. But other neighbors maintained hostility disguised as politeness, fulfilling their labor obligations to Ramon while privately resenting that a Mexican had proven superior to them. The community never fully integrated Ramon socially, never truly accepted him as equal despite being forced to acknowledge his expertise. He remained the successful Mexican farmer rather than simply a successful farmer, his ethnicity always noted as if it required explanation. The discrimination had become subtler after the drought, but had not disappeared, revealing how deeply prejudice was embedded and how resistant it was to change, even when circumstances should have transformed attitudes. Ramon accepted this reality with the same dignified pragmatism that had characterized his response to more overt hatred, focusing on his work rather than seeking validation from people who had proven themselves unworthy of respect. The final years of Ramon's active farming career through the 1990s saw him achieve financial success and regional influence that completely contradicted the failure his neighbors had predicted and desired when he first arrived. His 80 acres remained among the most productive in the county, generating revenues that exceeded much larger conventional operations. He had paid off his property completely within 8 years of purchase, owned all his equipment outright, and had accumulated significant savings that he invested in helping other Mexican farmers purchase land and build water systems. He never expanded beyond his original 80 acres, preferring to optimize what he had rather than pursuing growth for its own sake. He employed a small permanent crew and seasonal workers during harvests, known throughout the region as the best employer in agricultural labor because of fair wages and respectful treatment. His farm became a demonstration site where agricultural students and engineers came to study traditional water management, contributing to knowledge preservation and education that extended far beyond his property. Ramon's retirement in 2002 at age 80 transferred his property to the Mexican-American Farmers Cooperative he had helped establish decades earlier, ensuring that the land and its water system would continue serving agricultural purposes rather than being converted to development. He had refused multiple offers from developers willing to pay millions for property that had become valuable due to urban expansion, choosing instead to preserve agricultural land and the water system that had proven its worth. The cooperative continued operating his farm using the methods he had pioneered, maintaining productivity and serving as a training ground for young farmers learning traditional water management. Ramon spent his retirement writing extensively about Kanat systems and traditional agriculture, consulting with water agencies and universities, and mentoring young farmers of all ethnicities who sought knowledge that conventional agricultural education did not provide. He received various honors, including recognition from Mexico's Agricultural Ministry, awards from California water agencies, and an honorary doctorate from an agricultural university that had once refused him extension services. The legacy of what Ramon had hidden beneath his farm extended far beyond the 80 acres he personally managed to influence water policy, agricultural practices, and attitudes toward traditional knowledge throughout California and beyond. The Kanat systems that proliferated across California after the 1970s drought now stored hundreds of millions of gallons of water underground, providing crucial resilience during the increasingly frequent droughts that climate change brought to the region. Universities that once dismissed traditional agricultural knowledge now taught courses incorporating indigenous and historical water management techniques alongside modern engineering. Water agencies recognized that sustainable management required combining old and new knowledge rather than assuming modern methods were inherently superior. Most fundamentally, Ramon's story demonstrated that immigrants brought more than labor to America. They brought knowledge, skills, and cultural practices that could address problems that stumped mainstream experts. The neighbors who despised him for being Mexican had to confront the reality that his Mexican knowledge saved them, a lesson some learned genuinely, while others never truly accepted. Ramon Delgado died in 2015 at age 93. Having lived long enough to see traditional water management shift from dismissed primitive practice to recognized sophisticated technology and to witness young farmers of all backgrounds embracing techniques his grandfather had taught him in Guanajuato. His funeral drew hundreds of people, including farmers whose operations he had saved in 1976, researchers who studied his water systems, and Mexican-American farmers whose success he had enabled through mentorship and financial support. The cooperative operating his farm announced they would maintain his original Kanat system permanently as both a working agricultural installation and a historic monument to immigrant contributions to American agriculture. The county that had once discriminated against him named a Water Conservation Award in his honor, recognizing individuals who advanced sustainable water management. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from the children and grandchildren of neighbors who had mocked him, young people who had learned about Ramon's story and wrote letters expressing shame at their family's behavior and gratitude for the knowledge he had shared despite their ancestors' hatred. The story of Ramon Delgado and what he had hidden beneath his farm is ultimately about the value of knowledge that dominant cultures dismiss because of prejudice about the people who possess it. It is about the arrogance of assuming that formal education and modern methods are inherently superior to traditional practices developed over centuries by cultures facing similar challenges. It is about the resilience required to pursue your vision while surrounded by people who mock what they do not understand and who want you to fail because your success threatens their assumptions. It is about the choices people make when facing those who have harmed them, whether to embrace revenge or demonstrate the generosity their tormentors never showed. Most fundamentally, it is about how crisis reveals what truly matters, stripping away the social pretensions that allow prejudice to flourish and forcing people to acknowledge value wherever it exists. The Mexican immigrant neighbors despised for being different proved to have exactly what they needed to survive. And their response to that revelation, whether they learned genuine humility or merely grudging acknowledgement, revealed their ultimate character more clearly than 12 years of casual cruelty ever could.